A polynomial f of x has a factor, x minus k, if and only if the remainder is equal to 0. Show that x plus 3 is a factor, then find the remaining factors. Okay, so here they want us to show that this is a factor, and so we can use synthetic division for that. So since I have a plus 3, I'm going to use a negative 3 here. My coefficients are 1. I don't have an x squared, so I'm going to use a 0. And then I have negative 19 and negative 30. Bring down the 1. Negative 3 times 1 is negative 3. Plus 0 is negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. Plus negative 19 is negative 10 times negative 3 is positive 30. And so we get a 0. As I mentioned before, having 0 here is a very good thing. So I can get my quotient. Remember, it's 1 less power, so if you started with x cubed, then we're going to start with x squared minus 3x minus 10. Since we got remainder of 0, then I know that x plus 3 is going to be a factor. And basically, negative 3 is a 0. So x plus 3 is equal to 0. If you solve for that, you get your negative 3. But we need to find the other zeros. So to find the other zeros, we solve for x from the quotient. So we set that equal to 0. And then you can either factor or you can use the quadratic formula. So I'm going to check if this factors. We have x times x. 5 times 2 is 10. So I need a negative and a positive. Set my factors equal to 0. So x is 5 and x is negative 2. So my factor here is x minus 5 and x plus 2. And so those are our zeros, which we are also call solutions. Okay, so the idea is we use synthetic division. Once we have a 0 as a remainder, that tells me that this is a 0. Then I use the quotient and solve for x. If it's quadratic, then you can either factor or use a quadratic formula. Let's go to the next page. Show that x plus 2, x minus 4 are factors, then find the remaining factors. Okay, so I'm going to work with x plus 2 first. I'm going to use negative 2. It's the opposite of plus 2. And then my polynomial here is 8x to the 4th, so I'm going to use 8, negative 14, negative 71, negative 10, and 24. So this is to the 4th power. With synthetic division, we're going to break it down until we have a quadratic remaining. So we're going to bring down the 8. 8 times negative 2 is negative 16, plus negative 14 is negative 30, times negative 2 is positive 60, giving me a negative 11 once I add to negative 71. Negative 2 times negative 11 is 22, plus negative 20, or negative 10. So we get 12, times negative 2 is negative 24, and we get 0. So that's great. So after we do the synthetic division, we want to know what the quotient is. So remember, it's 1 less power, so this was x to the 4th. So now we started with 8x cubed minus 30x squared minus 11x plus 12. So now we use this quotient and we look at the second 0 they give us. It says minus 4, so I'm going to use a positive 4. And I'm going to use these coefficients. So 8, negative 30, negative 11, and 12. You could have used the 4 with the original, but since we're trying to break it down, that's why we're doing 2 synthetic divisions. So we bring down the 8. 8 times 4 is 32. 4 times 2 is 8. Plus negative 11 is negative 3. Negative 12 gives me 0. So that makes me happy there. And so the new quotient now with one less power. So if we started with 3, one less power would be 8x squared plus 2x minus 3. So notice now that this is quadratic, and so you have two options. Number one, you can try to factor, or number two, you can use the quadratic formula. Okay, so I'm going to use the quadratic formula because by looking at these numbers, it's not going to factor. So I'm going to write it up here. So x is equal to negative b, which is going to be 2. And negative b, or b squared, is 2 squared minus 4 times a times c divided by 2 times a. So we recall the quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. So that's what I use in here. Simplify. We get negative 2 plus or minus 2 squared is 4. Negative 4 times 8 is negative 32. Times negative 3 is positive 96 divided by 16. 4 plus 96 is 100 divided by 16. So here we can simplify the 100. The square root of 100 is 10 divided by 16. And so I get two answers. One answer is negative 2 plus 10 divided by 16, and the other is negative 2 minus 10 divided by 16. Negative 2 plus 10 is 8 over 16, which comes out to 1/2. And over here we get x is equal to negative 12 over 16, which comes out to negative 3/4. So we have this answer and this answer. So far, okay, so my zeros so far are x is equal to 1/2, which we got here, and x is equal to negative 3/4, which is this one. And then the other two zeros come from the synthetic division. So since I got 0 here, that makes this a 0. And since I got 0 here, that makes this one a 0. Okay. So the factors are basically, we take this number to the left side, so we get x minus 4, and bring the negative 2 to this side, x plus 2, and x minus 1/2, and x plus 3/4. And I'm writing the factors because later we're going to use these as well. Okay, let's look at example 10. Solve the equation given that x plus 2 is a factor, so determine all the zeros. Since they tell you this is a factor, we use synthetic division. So we have 1 minus 6 minus 130. Since they tell you it's a factor, your remainder should be 0. So negative 1 times 2 is negative 2, plus negative 6 is negative 8, times negative 2 is positive 16, plus negative 1 is 15, times negative 2 is negative 30. So we end up with 0. If you don't get a 0, then you know you did something wrong in here because they tell you that it is a 0. We use a synthetic division so that we can break this down to something that's quadratic. So my quotient will be one less power. So if we had a power of 3, now I'm going to have x squared minus 8x plus 15. Our next step is to use a quotient and solve for x. So at this point, you can try to factor, or you can use the quadratic formula. So I have x times x. 5 times 3 would give me 15. Since it's positive 15, I need both of them to be negative. Negative 5, negative 3 is negative 8. So I can set each factor equal to 0. So x is 3 and x is 5. So my answer is the zeros. So here I have x is equal to negative 2 is a 0, x equals 5 is a 0, and x equals 3 is a 0. My factors are x plus 2. I bring the 2 over here, bring the 5 to the left side by subtracting, and bring the 3 to the left side by subtracting. Number 11, solve the equation given that 1/3 is a 0. So 1/3 is a 0. So here I don't use the opposite sign because it's not written as x plus a number. So here when it has x plus a number, I use the opposite. Here they just tell me that 1/3 is a 0. So I would have to write 1/3. And actually there is a mistake here. This should say negative 1/3. So let me go ahead and change it to 1/3. So again, this should be negative 1/3. If you do it with a positive 1/3, then it's not going to be a 0. So there's a mistake there. So I'm just correcting that. Originally, it should have said negative 1/3. So my coefficients is 3, 7, negative 22, and negative 8. Bring down the 3 times negative 1/3 is negative 1. 7 plus negative 1 is 6 times negative 1/3 is negative 2. Plus negative 22 is negative 24 times 1/3 is going to be positive 8, giving me a 0. Okay, my quotient. So 1 less power is 2. So we're going to have 3x squared plus 6x minus 24. And we want to set that equal to 0. I'm going to divide by 3 for each term. So I get x squared plus 2x minus 8 is equal to 0. So let's see if this factors. So I'm going to write it up here. So I get x times x. 8 is 4 and 2, positive and negative. So x plus 4 equals 0. X minus 2 is equal to 0 for x. Okay. So what I did here is to make it easier, I can divide by 3 since it's a factor of everything. And then it's easier to factor. Or you can use the quadratic formula. So my zeros were x equals negative 4, x equals 2, and x equals negative 1/3. Okay, so that was the end of section 2.3. Finding the zeros given that something is a 0 or something is a factor. In section 2.5, we'll be able to find zeros when they don't give you this information.